I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Last Wednesday, a group of 28 armed men stormed into the home of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse, shot him a dozen times, and killed him. We don't know much about the alleged killers or their motives yet, and there are a lot of questions about how the assassins managed to pull this off.
Haiti's ambassador to the United States told Reuters the gunmen were masquerading as U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration agents, a move that would likely have helped them gain entry to Moïse's guarded residence.
Since Wednesday, the country's political climate's devolved even further into chaos than it was before the assassination, which didn't happen in a vacuum.
Moïse's assassination came amid calls for his resignation over corruption allegations, economic mismanagement, and his tightening grip on power. The nation of 11 million has grappled with political unrest for decades and faces a surge in gang violence and a growing humanitarian crisis.
And now, as the country tries to figure out who's in charge, there are calls for the U.S. to intervene and help stabilize things. And Haiti's interim government has formally asked the U.S. to send troops to protect its infrastructure.
The United States, Haiti's top aid donor, was quick to condemn Moïse's assassination and vowed to promote peace and security in the region.
But for a lot of people who study Haiti, like my guest Jake Johnston, there's a feeling of déjà vu. There's a long history of foreign intervention in Haiti, and it hasn't always worked out so well. Over 200 years ago, Haitian slaves freed themselves from their French colonial overlords, and then they had to pay the French back for their lost property. They were paying off that debt until 1947. They got invaded by the US for 30 years, and since then, they've been plagued by a series of coups d'etats and dictatorships backed by foreign countries. And so, considering all of this, it's not that surprising that Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere.
And I think very few external actors then take the time to look at what role their own governments, what role the US, Canada, France, and these other United Nations, right, have played in creating the current situation.
Jake Johnston is a senior research associate for the Center of Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He's the lead author of the center's blog about Haiti, which started a few weeks after the 2010 earthquake when billions of dollars started pouring into the country for its reconstruction. And since then, Jake's been watching where the money's been going. Today on The Decibel, what role have foreign actors and foreign aid played in creating the crisis Haiti is in right now? Let's get into it. Hi, Jake.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Really, really excited to talk to you about this very complicated situation.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So let's start with the latest. We are talking on Monday morning, and this is a quickly evolving story, and there are still a lot of unanswered questions, but we know at least 21 people are now in custody in connection with the assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse, and police say that the killing was carried out by foreign trained assassins, including former Colombian military veterans, and that a Haitian doctor was leading the charge and that he was plotting to assume the presidency. So the story is just getting more and more wild. And I guess my first question is, what do you make of all of this and everything that we've learned over the weekend?
Yeah, totally. It's a story that seems to just get sort of more convoluted and crazier by the day, right? And I think, it's important amid all of that to exercise patience and restraint, right? And to wait for more information to come out and not jump to conclusions, right? I think we've got bits and pieces of information, right? But I think there are significant questions that still need to be answered and that we don't know, right? And so we know there were some Colombian mercenaries who were in Haiti and who appeared to be involved, according to the Haitian government. But I think it's also important to note that, this is a government that even before the assassination really lacked credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of many Haitians. And so there's good reason that many are deeply skeptical of what is coming out in terms of official information.
And there is a power struggle happening in the country right now. And I wonder if you can tell me about the main players and who they are.
Yeah, certainly. So just for a little bit more context, I think it's important to note that, many legal experts, Haitian civil society organizations, maintain that the president's mandate actually expired in February 2021. And so his own mandate had been questioned. His own legitimacy had been questioned. His prime minister, of course, then also was facing questions over his legitimacy. So today we have three main players here in this sort of most immediate political power struggle. And I think that's an important distinction. So we've got a prime minister who was an interim prime minister on his way out. He had actually resigned and was going to be replaced last week. That's Claude Joseph. We have a nominated prime minister, Ariel Henry, and then the president of the Senate, Joseph Lambert. It's important to note there as well that the terms of parliament, all but these last 10 senators, actually expired in January 2020. So there's been no functioning parliament for over a year and a half now. Mm-hmm. And we've seen, in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, international actors, including the UN and the US, especially sort of rushed to provide some legitimacy and support to Claude Joseph as sort of the rightful heir to executive authority. And I think, it's clear that that's been met with significant resistance and concern in Haiti, not only amongst Ariel Henry and Joseph Lambert, but also more broadly, amongst grassroots and civil society organizations who, even before this assassination, were looking for something different, right? And talking about a inclusive process to come up with a sort of new path forward, a transitional government or some process to restore democratic governance in Haiti. And so I think, that's sort of the broad strokes of where we are today.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there is a distinction to be made and that we're talking about the political power struggle. But aside from that, what else do you think we should be considering?
So much, I think, the statements from the UN and the US and this sort of interest in gaining legitimacy through outside actors is a really important dynamic here, right? Because the political class is really looking externally for that legitimacy rather than looking internally, right? And so who gets excluded in that? Who's going to be represented in that resulting government? I mean, is it the interests of the vast majority of the population who are dealing with significant issues on a day-to-day basis? There are more than 4 million people facing food insecurity. Many people are too nervous to go outside and just do basic tasks because of the insecurity level right now in the capital. And so, these are real concerns. And I think it's extremely important when we're talking about the sort of political power struggle to realize that the vast majority of the people are not a part of that decision.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's why I wanted to bring you on the show, because you've been talking about the importance of understanding Haiti through the history of foreign intervention in the country. And I've seen you refer to Haiti as a quote unquote aid state. And many people would think of aid as a good thing. So can we maybe start with what you mean by that and why being an aid state is a problem? Why is that a useful way of looking at the country?
Really with aid state, it's sort of a correction to the idea or the belief from many that Haiti is a failed state. Mm-hmm. So, you look at Haiti today and so much of the response is, oh, well, Haiti's in crisis again. Okay, what else is new? We've seen this story before, right? And I think very few external actors then take the time to look at what role their own governments, what role, the US, Canada, France, and these other United Nations, right, have played in creating the current situation, right? And I think it's important to note, right, this has been something that's been developing for a very, very long time in that regard. So really what we're talking about with an aid state is a state whose institutions, whose sort of democratic or political structures are representative more of international intervention and international action than from the Haitian people themselves.
So I guess that's a good segue into the earthquake in 2010, which really devastated the country's infrastructure and killed thousands of people. And since then, Haiti has received $13 billion in aid from the international community. And some people argue that all of that aid has helped to perpetuate some of the country's biggest problems because it's allowed Haitian leaders to get away with not building up strong institutions and relying on foreign aid just to get by. And it's allowed violence and corruption to go unchecked. And so what do you make of that assessment?
Yeah, and I think it's not just that it's allowed that to happen. It has ensured that that would happen, right? I mean, when you look at billions of dollars spent from the international community, and it's not to say that none of it had any impact, right? Or there weren't positive projects here and there, but the vast majority of that money entirely bypassed both the Haitian government, local Haitian companies, and Haitian civil society organizations, right? So if you're thinking about why that money didn't build up those institutions, well, those institutions didn't see that money, right? And who did? It was largely contractors, grantees, NGOs, and church groups in the home countries of the countries who were providing the aid. And this is a significant factor here because that's not an accident. That is how the foreign aid system, the current foreign aid system, is designed. So in the U.S., for example, there are legal restrictions. Money has to be going to U.S. companies and through these U.S. entities to a certain extent. And so this system that we've developed, it's not about development in these other countries. It's about supporting our own interests, whether it be through aid that goes to change trade policies to make it more receptive to rice from the U.S., or if it's just to give money to a U.S. contractor to implement a program where 20-30% of the money comes off the top and goes to pay salaries and overhead for office space a few blocks from the White House in D.C., right? These things add up, right? And so billions of dollars sounds impressive, right? It sounds significant. How could this money have done so little? But when you start to look at where it actually goes, far less actually makes it into Haiti. And that's no mistake.
Yeah. The one example that comes to mind that some people might know about, some people might not know about, is the port that the U.S. wanted to build, which ended up being a complete and total failure. And I wonder if you can explain that to people and like what happened with that and how it's an example of what we're talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, this relates to so many different things because the port project itself was really in support of a bigger project, right? And so after the earthquake, the most significant reconstruction project, the flagship reconstruction project of the international community, was this thing, the Caracol Industrial Park. And again, this is something that had been planned. There was a lot of efforts to do it even before the earthquake. But after the earthquake, there was all of a sudden all of these billions of dollars on the table. And in order to lure a foreign company into Haiti to produce garments for export, donors used hundreds of millions of that dollars to provide subsidies to this company to come in. And part of those subsidies was the creation of a port, building of housing for workers, building the actual physical infrastructure for the building, and then obviously a tax-free environment in Haiti for at least 10 years. And so this port project, it begins with a few studies here and there and some technical consultants and millions get spent and it gets moved here and blocked there. And we're now in a position here 10 years later. And I think, it's almost sort of mind-boggling. I mean, dozens of millions of dollars, probably more than $50 million at this point on like studies and things like this to go towards a port that does not exist, right? And yet it's still an official program, right? I mean, this is still listed on, USAID's thing as something that they're working on doing. And at the same time, while that port's never existed, now there are concerns that the company, their 10-year tax-free period is running out. They might be having to lay people off. They might just leave Haiti altogether. And I think, this relates to a really important thing, right? So often this is justified, the lack of money going to Haitians, Haitian organizations, the Haitian government by corruption. They say, oh, well, Haiti's so corrupt, so we don't want to give them the money. It's really important to note that Haitians don't have a monopoly on corruption, right? We've got corruption in our countries too, okay? Tons of it. We've legalized a lot of it, right? I mean, you can lobby, you can do political donations, all of these things. We've legalized it, but it's the same system. And I think, there's a really good example here with the Caracol Industrial Park. We talk about accountability in Haiti, corruption in Haiti, but we never look at our own role in perpetuating those things or holding ourselves accountable for what we've done with this money as well.
Just coming back to what's happening today, I wonder what role foreign actors have played in the rise of Jovenel Moïse and his ability to stay in power in the way that he did.
Yeah, this is so crucially important right now, and especially as international actors are looking to pretty clearly take a more active role in Haiti right now. And there's a reason why many Haitians are deeply skeptical of that, right? And it's because what they've seen has been strong international support for this government, despite, the total erosion of human rights, of the rule of law, of democratic governance in recent years. And I think it's important to go back just a little bit, again, to the earthquake. So after the earthquake in 2010, Haiti held an election. Now, there were still 1 million people displaced by the earthquake when the time of this election took place. And surprising very few, the election was not good, right? It was a mess. Very few people were able to vote or wanted to vote. International actors were basically in control of the country at that point, running this reconstruction process. And yet...
And there was a cholera outbreak.
A cholera outbreak introduced by UN peacekeeping troops, right? And during the election, it sort of disintegrated into chaos in the afternoon. And instead of rerunning the election, trying to improve the infrastructure and do it again, the Organization of American States, this is a hemispheric body made up of governments from the entire region, sent a mission into Haiti and simply overturned the results of the election and put Michel Martelly, who had been in third place, into the runoff election. So Michel Martelly comes to power because of this intervention of the international community, right? And then, as he's in office, and not a single election held during his tenure, right, until the very, very end, Parliament becomes dysfunctional again. He replaces mayors by decree. There's erosion of human rights, and yet maintained this strong backing from international actors throughout. And then we get to the election of Jovenel Moïse. Now, that election, the first time, the results had to be thrown out due to fraud. And the only reason why that happened was because Haitians rose up and took to the streets to reject the results of the election. But that was in the face of both the US, the EU, Canada, the OAS, all insisting that the elections move forward despite these concerns. Now, the Haitian people won that battle. Right? They got this. They investigated the election, determined that it was actually fraudulent, threw out the results, and held it again. This was held in late 2016. Now, Jovenel Moïse won that election. Turnout was again below 20%. So Jovenel Moïse comes to office with about 590,000 votes in a country of 11 million people.
Right.
And the international community says, yay, we've got stability, we've got democracy, everything's going to be good now. But what could you expect? Like, do you really think that that is a democratic mandate, that there's real legitimacy there when so few people are actually participating, whether by choice or by repression or exclusion from the political process? Over time, this political system has developed into something that is as designed for international consumption as for the Haitian people, right? And it's the international actors who are funding the electoral process. They're providing technical assistance to the electoral apparatus itself, the ones who are just helping with the procurement of electoral materials. They pick up the ballots at the end, and then they fund the observers who provide legitimacy to the results, right? And so for Haitians, you look at this and you say, well, is it us who chooses our leaders, or is it the international community? And so it's not just that Jovenel Moïse, but it's Jovenel Moïse who represents the international community. He's there, as the belief of so many, because of the international community, right? And so you can't disentangle those things. And I think it's crucially important today, right, as we look to what happens next, is there's a reason why people in Haiti aren't looking for the international community to come in and try and solve anything, because they see the international community as having contributed to this problem in the first place.
Yeah. Wow. So now there are calls for foreign intervention to stop this crisis from spiraling even further out of control. So I've seen newspaper editorial boards in the U.S. calling on America to act. I know Haiti's requested the help of American troops, and Biden seems reluctant to send troops. What do you think of all of that?
I don't think international intervention is a solution here. I mean, I think it would be a mistake and simply a repeat of history. And we've seen how that works out. And I think more importantly than what I think, that's what Haitians are saying, right? I mean, this is what every Haitian civil society organizations, political leaders are all saying, whoa, 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 like, no, this cannot be an excuse to invade our country once again. And so, I think what's key here, right, is international actors. So few people have even been paying attention to Haiti, right? It's like the first time anyone's even noticing that Haiti exists in a long time. Yeah. And they're all looking and saying, oh my God, we need to do something now, right? And this rush to act, this rush for a short-term solution, and not taking pause and listening to what Haitians are actually asking for. Yeah. That's the critical thing here. We need to be listening to Haitian voices and making sure that those are the actors who are in charge of what comes next and are empowered to do so. And, no solution here is going to be imposed from abroad.
Yeah. But how do you address the immediate crisis without foreign intervention when it looks like there's such a power vacuum in the country right now? Like, what would that look like?
Well, I think there's, different things here. Again, it's really important to note that, there was a governance crisis before the assassination. Haitians have been having this conversation amongst themselves for months, years, right? And I think, again, supporting those processes, they exist. These people are organizing every day. They're fighting, right? They're resisting, they're pushing. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is this sort of rush to, choose a leader or pick a winner here, and not looking at sort of this more holistically and creating that space for a Haitian-led solution to this. And I think, again, so much of this is not going to be addressed in a day or two, right? Mm-hmm. It's just not feasible. That's not how these things work, right? And so there's a desire to fix everything in a day or something like that, or that if troops were there, everything goes away or everything's better. But that's not the case, right? These issues remain, and it's going to take time to figure them out. And I think, you've seen this already and we saw this after the earthquake as well. There's this perception, and I think, it's deeply rooted racist sort of belief, right? Going back to the Haitian Revolution, that Haiti can't manage its own affairs, that Haiti, in the absence of some strong international order or intervention, will descend into chaos and anarchy, right? And, to the extent that there has been a chaotic and anarchic situation in recent times, it's happened under the watch of that strong international leadership, not in the absence of it, right? This, again, goes way back to the revolution, right? To when Haiti was an independent nation and stood as a dangerous example for enslaved populations all across the world. And it was necessary to call them savages and people who couldn't handle their own business, right? To put that out there, to have that be the dominant narrative about Haiti, to try and prevent its success, because its success was a threat to the world order. Mm-hmm. And that has deep legacies. That continues today. Our popular imagination of Haiti, what we could think about it, is so rooted in that history, right? It's so rooted in how, mass media, politicians, pop culture has referred to Haiti for so long. And we need to do a lot of work to try and sort of unwind that, right? And really understand this history, our own role in it, and what we can do differently to support the Haitian people and not perpetuate these same institutions that have done nothing, but sort of perpetuate this system.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully this episode helps people do that. And Jake, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and I think people who are listening to this will have learned a lot. And thank you so much for doing so much heavy lifting in this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having the conversation. I think it's a really important one for us all to be having right now.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Jake Johnston of the Center of Economic and Policy Research. You can find his blog on Haiti at cepr.net. As always, if you want to email us, we're at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you ever want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. If you haven't followed us wherever you're listening, do that so you don't miss any episodes. And if you haven't already, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.